Thank you, Mr. Kanan. Would you like to say something?
So we have now finished with the 5 presentations. Is Mr. Sivaraman not available? Okay. So then we can go over to the questions. I think we have now 20 minutes time for questions, so we can go through some of them. So you are asked to give any input. If nothing comes up directly, I can start with that. So maybe coming back to the presentation from Vikas Singhvi and from Mr. Manjuri, I found it quite interesting with regard to the topic of, on the one hand, analyzing the hosting capacity, on the other hand, looking at the grid interconnection studies, and then also the coming into interconnection. And so I was quite curious about understanding. So the first step would be analyzing the hosting capacity, so how much wind power, for example, can be integrated into the system. But on the other hand, if it's not the hosting capacity is not sufficient, you have to do grid reinforcement, which means what you pointed out, it needs a number of years to build the lines. And so I'd like to refer to power curtailment, actually. So understanding a bit the process in more detail, because do you wait until interconnection of the wind farms until the hosting capacity has been increased after a couple of years, so you can really integrate it with full capacity? Or are you integrating it at an earlier stage and using power curtailment in the meantime until the lines are built? Maybe you can comment a bit about that.
So curtailment is a fact of life, I guess, and in a way it's not as bad, because what that shows is that you're maximizing utilization of the transmission system. So we often get into these arguments that, oh, we had these transmission loading line reliefs, or you redispatch my generation. But to me, what that is basically trying to say is you are really, really maximizing utilization of the transmission system. So going back to your specific question, if the wind farm is ready to build and operate commercially, if they met all the regulatory, all the tariff requirements, all the physical construction requirements, we do let them come on. There are a lot of studies that are performed both on an operational planning time frame. So by that I mean a week out to almost a year out, in terms of what are some of the weak spots in the system in terms of load levels, in terms of biases, in terms of outages. Outages is usually the biggest driver for curtailment. And then also within the operations realm, which is like the day off or the day ahead, or at the most up to a week. And then all of these studies are documented in what we call operating guides. So if a certain situation arises that we have already seen through studies, then the operators know what to do based on the operating guide. So those conditions typically have been studied, and there is a good awareness of what needs to be done. So, and it may not necessarily be the wind farm causing the problem. So even though a particular resource was studied, it needs a new transmission line to be built before it can interconnect. But it did go ahead and interconnect anyway. But the market, when we would redispatch, we may not redispatch that resource because it's more economic than something else. So I guess that nexus between reliability and economics kind of plays out really well, because the focus of the market is maintaining reliability at minimum cost. So if typically the renewable resources are lower cost, so even if they are the ones that are triggering the problem, they are not necessarily the ones that are getting curtailed or redispatched, because they are a more economic source of megawatts for our market.
So maybe just to ask again in more detail, so that means for wind power plants that are connected in the system, there is normally no delay because of delays in grid reinforcement to interconnect the power plant. you see that there are issues where there is curtailment, you're doing redispatch looking for the cheapest unit. Okay, so this is quite, just like to make the point, because in Germany we have there another situation, so we have to connect the plants, and so we have delays, and so we delays in grid reinforcement, and so we have to curtail the units actually, so they are compensated in power and in the cost. So it's a different situation, and it's quite interesting to see and understand how it is done in different countries actually.
Just I would add one small comment. Sorry.
I have just one to just supplement it. Yeah. That means in wind farms, they are always in the market. They do not have a long-term tie-up. Because since the transmission assets are not being built for them, so they have to wait if something is there, if it is cheaper, economical, so something will be stopped and they will be pushed in. Is it like that?
To make sure I understood your question, so if the wind farm's built and it's connected, would it displace somebody else? Is that the question?
Two things.
Yeah.
One is the ones you are, number one is wind farms, whether do have a long-term tie-up to sell,
yes,
let's say for a few years. If it is for a few years, that means the transmission access should be available to him all the time. The second, if access is not available, and he is basically surviving on economics, that means it must be displacing some costly power. Is it like that?
Yeah, so we actually see a combination. There's a range of players. So there are certain developers who are bigger companies, they have deep pockets. They don't necessarily need the long-term certainty of the revenue. So they are almost in a hurry to get to the market as soon as possible. So in fact, we have a tariff provision which allows them to interconnect, forget about the transmission, even before the studies are completed, they can actually interconnect. Of course, they have restrictions identified to the extent if they are interconnecting into a region where we know the transmission is deficient, we'll study and we'll put a hard cap. So it's not just a curtailment, it will just be a hard cap. So if it's a 100 megawatt unit and studies show that no more than 20 megawatts can be interconnected, then we'll let them interconnect up to 20 megawatts. Then the studies would be completed, then we'll identify what reinforcements are necessary, then they can go up to 100 megawatts, even before the transmission is completed, but very likely they may not be able to operate it at 100 megawatts all the time. But a majority of the players that we see, they do need or rely on long-term power purchase agreements, 20 years, 30 years, so they do fund the transmission. So to your point, like we wouldn't hold them back so long as they have a commitment to build the transmission or fund the transmission rather. So once they sign off, then yes, we will let them come on and then they can operate as the system allows.
I have another question to Mr. Singhvi. Yeah. See, I am not clear about that the tool, you know. You said it is the hosting capacity it is determining. In a transmission system, it is quite elaborate. And in distribution system, it is in a very pretty bad shape. So your tool is only for transmission or for distribution?
This tool is mainly for transmission, but we have a similar tool which we use for distribution as well.
In transmission, and you say that it should not be taken for investment purpose.
So it's more of a screening tool, so it's long-term plan, interconnection planning. I guess when you're trying to see...
It is required by whom?
No,
the tool is for whom?
So APRI basically, I mean, it's a non-profit organization. So, so we have...
Whom means it is for a transmission licensee, or it is for...
Somebody like MISO, you know, so the peak of our queue, we are 85,000 megawatts in the queue that are waiting to be studied. Almost every 5 megawatts out of 6 was from wind. So there is no easy way for us to study everything, and then we have tariff timelines that we have to honor, otherwise folks can go and complain. So somebody like MISO could benefit from the tool that APRI is producing so that we can screen out a lot of these projects in a sufficient time frame and give the response back to the customer saying, hey, it's going to cost you $100 million, it's going to cost you maybe $100,000.
It is basically a screening purpose.
Yes. Yeah. So it's kind of the first step.
Classify
right.
the costly schemes,
right.
The cheaper schemes, which should be taken up
Right.
Okay.
So it
okay.
will be an
good.
indicative
Yeah.
answer, as Vikas said, you can't build something based on those results, but it will be an indication of broadly what your exposure is.
And where you need more detailed studies as well.
Okay, okay, thank you.
So maybe more questions from the audience? Yeah, please.
Tom Brown, University of Frankfurt. Again to Mr. Manjare, you mentioned transmission cost allocation. What algorithm do you use for that, and how do you deal with the fact that the usage of the line might change over the 50 years of it being operated?
Yeah, so there is no algorithm. I wish it was that simple that we would just have an algorithm and get done with it. So cost allocation is the most contentious effort that I've ever been involved with. It is, and no matter how much effort you spend, nobody's ever happy at the end of it because there's always something that somebody didn't get. So what we've done is we've kind of, instead of having an algorithm, we've kind of coded the different types of transmission projects in our tariff. So based on the intended use of that transmission, we have the corresponding beneficiaries and then the corresponding people who would fund the transmission. So if it's so if I'm a factory and I need a new line just to support my factory, nobody else benefits from that line, then I'm going to be the one who's going to fund the line. So it's called a participant funded, because there's no other benefit to anybody else from that line. Let's say it's a group of 15,000 megawatts of wind interconnecting, and there's multiple, say, 345 kV transmission lines going on, right? So clearly, not only those lines are going to benefit the new wind resources, but it's also going to help from a load serving perspective. It's going to help from market efficiency perspective, might help with some compliance obligations through NERC and so on and so forth. So it's a fairly broadly required transmission facility, multiple beneficiaries spread across time, spread across geographical jurisdictions. So those are then kind of prorated across the footprint because there are multiple beneficiaries. Now, it could be that there is a transmission facility needed just to interconnect a new generating facility. So, but even then, it is just to interconnect, it's a network facility. It is still 345 kV. So there are clearly other beneficiaries also. So then those costs are shared between the market participant and then the other footprint. So like 80% is funded by the customer, 20% is kind of prorated across the footprint. So there's 4 or 5 different categories of transmission projects that very painstakingly have been agreed upon and are currently in the tariff. It could change tomorrow. I mean, there's always people who are not quite happy with the way costs are allocated. For some reason, people are very crazy about money. I don't know why.
Thank you. Any more questions?
My name is Manohar Lal Khirbat. Globally, we are touching around 400 gigawatt wind energy and solar. But from the studies, we find that we are lagging too much behind how to penetrate the renewable energy in the system. When it will be catching up the renewable energy. Because it is still in the study stage. We have not come into a prototype which has been tested for various system studies, various parameters. So we are lagging behind a lot of this thing.
The question is not clear. Could you?
My mind is that globally we are touching around 400 gigawatt of renewable energy, but from the system study we find integration of renewable energy into the system, it is still in the study stage. When we will be catching up the increase in the renewable energy to the transmission lines? Still is not clear.
Is the question, when can we really...
When we can catch up with the growth of the renewable energy, transmission lines, grid.
So the way I understood it, how or when can we sufficiently expand the grid to accommodate...
Because we are still in the study stage.
Okay, so and then the 400 gigawatts was from a global context, or? Global context. Oh, so I think that's a... Yeah.
It is simple. It is a development is a continuous process. It never ends. Let's say in a country like us, India, we have to, our total capacity is 330 gigawatt. You can't build the transmission system for 1,000 gigawatt. You are built because it is expensive. Somebody has to pay for it. It is, let's say the transmission cost, somebody has to bear it. So it is not that transmission is lagging because that is why the renewable is not able to come up. It is not so. So thing is like this is a small anomaly is coming. It is not that very large difference. Today if you see, as far as the national grid is concerned, there is no congestion as far as renewable energy is concerned. There is some congestion, some local network, maybe at 132 kV, maybe at 220 kV. If you see the highways like 765 kV, 400 kV, there is no large HVDC project, there is no such large congestion. See, total, you might have seen in the country, one price for the entire country today. The entire country having one price in the month of June, 27 days out of 30 days, one price. That means zero congestion. Whoever wants to sell, wherever he wants to sell, he was able to sell. So it is not that everything should be built, then only renewable comes. This is, both things has to go simultaneously.
My friend was saying that in USA, transmission line takes some 6 to 7 years for the renewable energy when it is there. So in that context, I said that we are lagging too much behind. When USA is lagging so much, 6 to 7 years.
It is a construction time, it is not lagging. It is construction time. It takes 6 to 7 years because the transmission, the right of way is the most critical issue in transmission line. But everybody wants transmission line to be built, but not in their land. It should be built in some other's land. That is the issue. That is why it's taking more time. It is not that they are lagging.
No, I was just comparing that in India we can build a transmission line in 4 years or 3 years. In USA, I was surprising when he says that it takes, from planning, it takes 6 to 7 years.
So if you go to Kerala, you will find 7 years. It is not that, see, the more people are aware about their rights and the usage of land, then you will have more time. Okay, thank you.
There's a topic here that brings together the different things that we've just been talking about. So my experience is that actually 7 years isn't terribly long to build a transmission line. In Western Europe, it will take you more than 10 years. And even then, you might not get it. They've got this phrase, it's called NIMBY, not in my backyard. So no one wants a transmission line built next to their house that's going to destroy land values. So instantly, you have to look at getting communities and everything on board, and it's that delay that creates things like transmission congestion. We've gone in the UK to such an extent we've had to build transmission lines offshore because no one can put them on land. You just can't get permission. It is impossible. And if you take the scenario that National Grid, the system operator, the MISO equivalent in the UK has, they estimate that with the renewable direction, we're going to double the installed base of generation that's going to be on the bars. So you go from 90 gigawatts to about 170 gigawatts over the next 5 to 10 years. But they're not going to build any more infrastructure to host that. What they're going to have is what they call dynamic hosting, so dealing with the constraints in an operational timescale, sharing the network between the different types of generators, and the market and the flexibility services really being the mechanism in which to make sure that enough of the peaking plant is there, but that the renewables and everyone can share the physical infrastructure as best as possible. Because all these things are not just a financial impact, they have social impacts, they have environmental impacts. So it's all these topics about who pays for it, how you allocate hosting capacity, how you share hosting capacity, how you build grid, they're all actually interlinked.
So maybe to have a final comment on that, and also to close the session, as we are actually before lunchtime. So yeah, we have also more questions maybe. So
I just have one question. I'm from IIT Kanpur. I'm a research scholar there. So with the penetration of wind, you people have talked about the lowering of inertia. and about frequency stability. There's one more issue, the alteration of oscillations, the small signal oscillations. Can you just shed light on what has been the experience in this particular context, the oscillation characteristics, how they change, and how do you plan for that in terms of control actions that have to be taken in this particular context?
Sorry, I have not done the studies on oscillators.
So, well,
It's part of the hosting capacity analysis.
So are you talking about small signal oscillations, right? I think it's, yeah, it depends, right? I mean, you can always use the plan itself for damping purposes, but I have not seen, any wind plant doing as of now damping this local oscillations it's getting.
At the system operator level, is there any study which is being done on the oscillation characteristics? Like if I am even planning for the wind energy which is to be penetrated in the grid, then the frequency stability is a problem which everybody studies. But is there any long-term planning which is done in the terms of how the oscillation scenarios are going to change?
Yeah, so there's actually a regulatory requirement for, not exactly sure who it applies to, but it applies to MISO, I think, as a reliability coordinator or a planning coordinator, that every 5 years we have to perform a small signal stability assessment. So it's completed as part of our regular planning process. We've not really initiated a separate study, so to speak, because our wind penetration, even though absolute scale is pretty large, 16,000 megawatts is not small, on a relative scale, we have a 190,000 megawatt of generation fleet. So percent penetration is still pretty low, less than 10%. So, and intrinsically, I guess we've historically not had small signal oscillations, either local or between regions. Long time ago, it was before my time, before I was with MISO, there used to be a quarter hertz oscillation problem between MISO and some other system, but that has since been mitigated through a lot of transmission development. So even though we perform these studies, we've not really found any issues or constraints to date, primarily driven by small signal stability.
And more or less not because of the wind penetration, it's because when you start displacing a lot of central station generation, then you start seeing this problem. So I think there is a requirement which Durgesh, probably for any major change in generation fleet, they have to do a small signal stability study.
No, you are correct that this is an evolving process. See, a lot of wind plants have come. These are small pockets. And these small oscillations will take place when there is an outage kind of operation. So since these are in a very early stage today, and the operators today do not have wide area measurement, the complete of the, see, you can't there is no sensor today to notice it also, unless you have PMUs in place throughout the grid, which is now happening. Maybe this issue will come up, time to come, as the penetration increases and your sensors are in place.
Just to add up on that, actually, if you go through some of the reports of the POSOCO from the PMU inputs, you will find that they have talked about the small oscillations and all in the system. So please go through that report.
Okay, thanks all. We have now time to close the session, and thanks all for participation, especially to the presenters with the relevant presentations and for the good discussion. So enjoy lunch and follow up with the discussions during the lunch break. Thank you.
Thank you also.